I needed to take a couple of days to really digest the news regarding Cardinal Donald Wuerl. If you somehow haven't heard, I'll break the story down for you. On Monday afternoon, the Pennsylvania grand jury released a 1,300-page report detailing the systematic cover-up of the sex abuse of minors by priests. The cover-up was conducted by the various bishops of the state of Pennsylvania, including one now Cardinal Donald Wuerl. To be clear, these cases had already been resolved. No new allegations have been made about priests and bishops abusing minors. However, the details are truly disturbing. In this video, I intend to go over the fallout of the grand jury report and the bizarre defensive world that the mainstream Catholic media has engaged in. However, the worst of the details. From the New York Times. One priest was willing to admit to molesting boys, but denied reports from 2 girls who had been abused. They don't have a penis, he explained. Another priest, asked about abusing parishioners, refused to commit. With my history, he said, anything is possible. Yet another priest finally decided to quit after years of child abuse complaints, but asked for, and received, a letter of reference for his next job, at Walt Disney World. What we can say, though, is that despite some institutional reform, individual leaders of the church have largely escaped public accountability. Priests were raping little boys and girls, and the men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all. For decades, monsignors, auxiliary bishops, archbishops, cardinals have mostly been protected. Many, including some named in this report, have been promoted. Until that changes, we think it is too early to close the book on the Catholic Church sex scandal. He emphasized the high cost of incarceration. In another case, a priest raped a girl, got her pregnant, and arranged an abortion. The bishop expressed his feelings in a letter. This is a very difficult time in your life, and I realize how upset you are. I, too, share your grief. But the letter was not for the girl. It was addressed to the rapist. On June 28, 2003, a second known victim wrote a statement detailing the sexual abuse committed by Graf on him. The second known victim indicated the abuse occurred in the rectory of the Holy Guardian Angels Elementary Middle School when the second victim was in the 7th grade. The second victim detailed the grooming techniques of Graf. After the grooming period, Graf had him take his pants down and sit down. Graf then fondled the second victim's penis as Graf masturbated. According to the second victim, when he questioned Graf about the abuse, Graf responded by telling the second victim that it was okay because he was, quote, an instrument of God. The second victim indicated the abuse occurred over the next 6 months as Graf would have the second victim come to his room, where Graf would masturbate both himself and the second victim. The second victim believed his friend and other boys were also abused by Graf during the same period. The church had documented numerous reports of Father Graf's abuse over the years, the grand jury report says, and yet when they came to light publicly, the church downplayed and denied its knowledge. However, the diocesan statement stands in stark contrast to the evidence held within the records of the diocese. While the diocese stated they were surprised, internal records documenting the opinion of the bishop showed constant references to Graf as being a, quote, risk, a concern, and a legal liability. This language was much more consistent with language used in relation to predatory priests than a priest with a drinking problem. At St. John Evangelist Church, Giela met a family who warmly embraced him as their parish priest. The family included 8 girls and 1 boy. Giela began sexually abusing the girls almost immediately upon his appointment to the parish. Giela sexually abused 5 of the 8 girls. Giela also abused other relatives of the family. He conducted a wide array of crimes cognizable as misdemeanors or felonies under Pennsylvania law. The grand jury report that it had uncovered a ring of predatory priests in the Pittsburgh diocese who shared intelligence or information regarding victims, created pornography using the victims, and exchanged victims among themselves. This group of priests used whips, violence, and sadism in raping their victims, the report states. George recalled that each of these priests had a group of favored boys who they would take on trips. The boys received gifts, specifically gold cross necklaces. George stated, he, Zerwas, had told me that they, the priests, would give their boys, their altar boys, or their favorite boys, these crosses. So he gave me a big gold cross to wear. The grand jury observed that these crosses served another purpose beyond the grooming of the victims. They were a visible designation that these children were victims of sexual abuse. They were a signal to other predators that the children had been desensitized to sexual abuse and were optimal targets for further victimization. This isn't the worst of it. Far from it, in fact. Cardinal Wuerl is credibly accused of covering up a child porn operation in his diocese involving at least 1 priest who filmed in a parish church. The following is from churchmilitant.com. Churchmilitant.com reports the following. Father George Zerwas got bonus payout in exchange for silence on other priests' criminal sexual conduct. Among the most disturbing details in the 884-page Pennsylvania grand jury report that was then Bishop Donald Wuerl of Pittsburgh gave a priest involved in a child porn ring extra money in exchange for the priest's silence. Not only that, Wuerl gave the priest a glowing eulogy at his funeral in 2001, even posthumously restoring him to the full priestly status. Page 233 of the grand jury report, released Tuesday, reveals that in 1996, Father George Zerwas informed the Pittsburgh Diocese that he had knowledge of other Pittsburgh Diocese priests' involvement in illegal sexual activity. In exchange for this information, he demanded that his sustenance payments be increased. In response to this request, Wuerl instructed him to document in writing the names of the priests involved or state that he had no knowledge of what had previously claimed, the grand jury report continues. Wuerl advised that this action had to be undertaken before Zerwas could receive any additional assistance. After Zerwas disavowed any knowledge of priest involvement in illegal sexual activity in a letter to the diocese, he was granted an additional financial stipend and his sustenance payments were continued. That stipend was used to fund Zerwas' homosexual lifestyle in Cuba, where he lived for several years in a Havana apartment with his younger Cuban boyfriend, and served as liaison to foreigners looking to hook up with male Cuban prostitutes. It was Zerwas' boyfriend who found his body on the morning of May 27, 2001, murdered by a Cuban rent boy Zerwas had picked up and brought back to the night before. The rent boy, Abel Medinas Valdez, later confessed to killing the priest by shooting animal tranquilizer into the base of his neck, causing cardiac paralysis. Valdez also confessed to having murdered 2 other foreigners. Zerwas' case is even more bizarre when it's revealed he was part of a pederast ring in Pittsburgh involving 4 priests who used whips and chains on teen altar boys who were plied with drugs and alcohol and passed around for sex. The priests began a conversation about religious statues and asked George to get up on a bed. As the priests watched, they asked George to remove his shirt, and then they drew an analogy to the image of Christ on the cross and told George to remove his pants so that his pose would be more consistent with the image of Christ in a loincloth. At that point, the priest began taking Polaroid pictures of George. As the picture taking continued, the priest directed George to take off his underwear. George was nervous and complied. George recalled that either Zula or Pucci operated the camera. He stated that all of the men giggled and stated that the picture would be used as a reference for new religious statues for the parishes. George testified that this occurred before he turned 18 years old and that his genitals were exposed in the photographs. George stated that his photograph was added to a collection of similar photographs depicting other teenage boys. The teen boys specifically chosen for grooming by this group of priests were given gifts of gold chains with a cross. The necklace served as a sign indicating which boys had been picked for sexual abuse. They were signaled to other predators that the children had been desensitized to sexual abuse and were optimal targets for further victimization, the grand jury noted. Wuerl never told police or the prosecutor in the late 1980s any of the information he had learned about the priest pederast ring, Washington District Attorney John Pettit complaining at the time Wuerl was uncooperative. The diocese first started receiving sex abuse complaints against Zerwas as early as 1987. A second complaint early 1988 involved inappropriate touching of a young man Zerwas sent away to a local hospital for treatment. On his return, he was placed in active ministry, only for 2 more complaints to surface in November 1988, after Wuerl was installed as the Bishop of Pittsburgh. A 16-year-old boy had said Zerwas had fondled his genitals, and a 17-year-old boy came forward and said he had also been sexually abused by the priest. Wuerl sent Zerwas away to St. Luke's Institute and on his release placed him back in active ministry. Wuerl never reported the priest's crimes to law enforcement. In 1991, a young man told the diocese Zerwas had groped his genitals. Wuerl simply transferred the priest to a new parish, his 3rd parish assignment in 2 years. In 1996, diocesan records show that an outraged mother of one of Zerwas' victims met with the diocese to complain that the bishop had allowed the priest to continue in active ministry for years, in spite of the abuse her son had suffered at the priest's hands in 1998, and in spite of promises from the diocese that the situation had been handled. 2 of the priests in the pederast ring were eventually prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison. Nothing ever happened to Zerwas, even though his name came up in court testimony in the late 1980s, linking him to the pederast ring. Instead, Zerwas spent his retirement in comfort, living off a monthly stipend from the diocese, paid by Catholic laity, using it to fund his homosexual lifestyle in Cuba. His boyfriend would later reveal that Zerwas was a fixture of the gay scene in Havana, his apartment a popular stopping place for foreign visitors. Meanwhile, the diocese was telling the public Zerwas was ministering to the poor in Cuba. So, what do we have here? An institutionalized cover-up of pedophilia was orchestrated by Cardinal Wuerl when he was a bishop. Worse is the fact that when Wuerl paid a ransom to a pederast priest in order to guarantee silence. Why pay him off? Because the priest had the dirt on other activity that would have certainly brought the wrath of the state against Wuerl and the other bishops in Pennsylvania. Wuerl, as a cardinal archbishop, would have had knowledge of all these problems in the areas he oversaw, all of Pennsylvania. Wuerl authorized payoffs using money from parish collection plates to buy the silence of these priests when it was possible. Obviously, many voices in the Catholic media are calling for Wuerl to resign, but not the voices of the mainstream Catholic media. One such article is from the National Catholic Register, the online print publication of EWTN, the nation's principal legacy Catholic broadcast station. The Register, in reporting on the Pennsylvania grand jury report, buried mention of Wuerl to one paragraph near the end of a lengthy article, and even then downplayed the accusations against him. The article goes on to only say that Wuerl was mentioned 200 times in the report, but does not mention the worst of his offenses or any offenses at all. Again, I've already outlined those offenses above. Another article in the Catholic World Report, another big-shot mainstream Catholic media outlet, makes no mention of Wuerl at all despite publishing on the cover-up the day of the grand jury report. In fact, the Catholic World Report went on to put front and center the Jesuit and other leftist elites in the church and their statements that have attempted to downplay the crisis that has developed. Pro-sodomite priests like Father Rosica and others have been on defense because it is clear that the laity have had enough of the cover-ups, the deception, and the plague of Episcopal sodomites in the church. But it gets worse. The USCCB has released tone-deaf statements speaking of sorrow about the past abuse of minors and the cover-up that followed, but has offered no concrete steps to prevent this from happening in the future. And they have made exactly zero promises to purge the same sex attracted from the seminaries, the priesthood, and the episcopacy. Instead, it is obvious that the USCCB, an organization that itself has no business existing in the first place, is going to attempt to wait out the laity. But they will be in for a rude awakening come November, when they meet in Baltimore for their annual conference. Already, over 1,000 lay faithful have promised to protest outside the venue and demand that all bishops guilty of either crimes or silence resign from their posts immediately. The USCCB has remained silent on the demands of the faithful. But it gets even worse. Pope Francis elevated to the episcopacy a pro-sodomite priest who is rumored to live an active San Francisco lifestyle, and he did this during the week the Wuerl cover-up of abuse by same-sex attracted priests was making headlines around the world. The tone deafness is staggering, but should we expect better? Wuerl has stated publicly that he will not resign and has been emboldened by the complicit Catholic media and the Vatican hierarchy. Wuerl has lawyered up, hiring the famous Jones Day law firm, who usually defend corporations accused of malfeasance. And who do you think is paying for that law firm? The laity, through their donations to the chanceries and in weekly collections at the parish level. My own thoughts are this, that those Catholics who protest outside the November meeting of the USCCB need to arrive in sackcloth and ashes. The bishops and cardinals of the Church in America should adorn themselves in sackcloth and ashes, but frankly, we can't expect anything so penitential from them. Those protesters should then peacefully but forcefully protest against them, as well as engage in a campaign of prayer and fasting. The corruption in the church is both material and spiritual, and we cannot neglect the spiritual side of the problem. In the next week, I plan to upload a video detailing the roots of this problem. The cover-ups are the result of a two-pronged campaign waged against the church starting more than a century ago, and we were warned by church leaders of this impending crisis. And the church stopped fighting after the Second Vatican Council. But that's a topic I'll cover next week. Thank you for listening. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. You can follow me on social media with links in the description. Dominus Vobiscum.